This video is brought to you by ROCKETMAN. Check out the link in the video description or keep watching to learn more. What if I told you that every good suburban rail system has a number of common features? And by features, I mean, well, stations. If you've been following me on Twitter, which you absolutely should, you'll know I've been talking a lot about Front Spadina station in Toronto. A planned station that I have talked about in a lot of videos. Now, this video isn't about Toronto, it's about suburban rail generally, and why two types of station in particular are critical to create a functional and successful network. Let's dive into it. The truth is, and perhaps their name suggests this, modern suburban rail systems should avoid being overly downtown-centric. And to some degree, this means literally not just focusing on a single massive hub in the central business district. This is for a couple of reasons. For one, rail can and should serve destinations around the city core rather than just in the center of the city core. For one, this means you don't put all of your eggs in one basket infrastructure-wise, but it also means you can probably have some cost savings, since pushing infrastructure to its max often requires a lot more expensive projects and optimizations than just building more infrastructure and spreading your load. This can be done with what I like to call shoulder stations. This can often happen with less constraints than in the center of the city because you're not in the center of the city, but also because you often have adjacent rail yards and the like that you see just outside of a central station. And of course, the shoulder station benefits not just the passengers who might use it, but also passengers going onwards, who have a little more breathing room at their main station and onboard their trains. Shoulder stations take advantage of a feature that a lot of railways historically have, which is approaches to central stations where several lines, which might turn out to be several lines that go in completely different geographic directions, all converge to enter the central station. This means that a station which simply spans the approach, ideally some distance away from the central station, can serve all of these lines, meaning a ton of connections are possible, especially if you can match that shoulder station up with, say, a metro connection. An underappreciated feature of this is that not only do you create all of this connection opportunity, but you also free up capacity on the most valuable part of your network. If people don't have to travel all the way into the central station, that means there's free capacity going from the shoulder into the center, and perhaps beyond, which is really, really valuable. This is similar to the way that loop lines and other metro lines can sometimes carry absurd numbers of passengers, by having single train journeys be utilized for multiple passenger trips. Now, there are a lot of examples of places where this could even make sense in North America. One of the best is somewhere around Sunnyside Yard in New York, where a well-placed station could serve Penn Access trains that will be using the Northeast Corridor, as well as various Long Island Railroad routes, including those trains traveling to East Side Access. Interestingly, Chicago kind of does this on the Metra Electric, possibly because electrical multiple units, but it could also stand to do it at a lot of its other major stations.
Now, if you're fortunate enough to be located in a Canadian city and you're watching this channel, chances are you're taking public transit. Streetcars, buses, and maybe even subway trains. With the Canadian winter in full force, I made sure to save my local bus stop and subway station in ROCKETMAN, so that I can check when my next transit vehicle is coming before even walking out of the door. I also use ROCKETMAN to stay informed with real-time transit delays and alerts right in the app, and I can even find out exactly where my bus is with live vehicle locations for a seamless travel experience on transit. Join me in using ROCKETMAN today. Check out the link in the description and download ROCKETMAN for free on both iOS and Android.
Now, you might comment that these stop spacings are tight, and you're often not wrong, but the truth is that tight stop spacings are commensurate with density, which is still going to be very high, since you're often within proximity of that central station and a central business district. And smart cities will focus development along shoulder stations. I mean, Tokyo doesn't really have shoulder stations as much as it has a ring of massive stations where it spreads the load of development, with several central business districts developed over time. Now, as you might imagine, a lot of cities around the world have shoulder stations, even on lines which aren't through running, even though that does sweeten the deal quite a bit. For example, in Sydney, south of Sydney Central is Redfern. In Copenhagen, northeast of the central station is Oosterpoort. And east of Liverpool Street in London is Stratford, which was at points in the pandemic the most used station in the entire UK because of the value of those off-peak connections. As it turns out, shoulder stations often act as another really important form of stop. Junction stations. These are what they sound like, a station at or adjacent to a rail junction. Probably the most famous example of such a station is Clapham Junction in London, which serves both the South West Main Line and the Brighton Main Line. But the truth is that any station that is on a rail line or rail corridor which branches out and is adjacent to a junction kind of serves this role. It allows for interchanges between various different potential trips. So why are junction stations so important? Well, as I mentioned before, they often play a similar role as shoulder stations, allowing people to make transfers outside of the city's center, which can relieve the load on that city center station, but also make a lot more trips viable. Perhaps a more fitting shoulder example would be Vauxhall, which is 2 kilometers southwest of Waterloo and serves a lot of massive development that's also served by the new Northern Line extension. Now, the role of a junction station, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is not just to provide some local connectivity, but also to enable trips from one rail line to another that otherwise might be somewhat impractical. The closer the station is to the junction, the better, because it means less backtracking, something that people really don't like. Now, it's really critical to have these junction and transfer points within a suburban rail network, because suburban rail networks tend to be incredibly high capacity. Everyone is making transfers and last mile journeys via local transit or even metros and subways. You can quickly overwhelm those lower order forms of transit, which is why it's critical to create a network within a suburban rail system itself. You want to keep people on this mode of transit as long as possible to avoid overwhelming other forms. Of course, there's also a dual importance to that. By providing compelling journeys within a suburban rail network, there's more ridership. Some trips won't even exist if you don't provide compelling junction opportunities for people to switch lines. Because to some extent, it might even just look impractical on a map to ride all the way into the city center just to ride back out of it. Now, while both of these station types are great, part of why I have been thinking about them is that Toronto isn't really building many of them at all. And this part of the video is a bit more about Toronto and my frustrations. Now, to give credit where credit is due, there is kind of one shoulder station being built in the city, which is East Harbour, east of the downtown core around the Don River, where there's also going to be a subway connection, which is pretty great. Things get much worse from here though. For one, there's a 3-kilometer gap between East Harbour and Union Station, with tons of room and some of the densest development in Canada, not to mention incredibly valuable real estate. Is there a station, even with less platforms to serve only a few lines? No, and none appears to be planned. A location that's much further out of the city, but still has the same problem, would be Scarborough and Scarborough Junction, the area. This is extra frustrating because there is literally a station at this location, but most services on the Stouffville line, which kind of travels east from downtown Toronto and then north from Scarborough Junction, they don't even stop at this location. The trip from the Lakeshore east of Scarborough Junction, north on the Stouffville line is so natural. There's a real difference in direction between those two lines, which makes that trip at least seem more attractive to people. If you have two lines where the angle between them is really small, people kind of feel like they're backtracking, and they're not necessarily wrong. A similarly frustrating situation exists at King Liberty, which is kind of the equivalent of Scarborough Junction, but with the Barrie, Kitchener, and Milton lines. More frustrating is that this station is really close to the center of the city. While there is more local demand to serve at this station, so transfers are maybe a little less valuable, and because the Kitchener and Barrie and Milton lines are all a bit more similar in their direction, this might be a slightly less attractive place to have a junction station, but at the same time, the station is being designed with platforms that could serve the various lines. But instead, some of the platforms will simply go unused, which just doesn't make sense to me. Why spend the money on the platforms if you're not even going to use them? There's an even bigger problem here though, and that's because the station is in the city center. Those trips traveling from King Liberty into Union Station are at a premium. So freeing up even a small amount of capacity should be seen as a big win, but we don't seem to be planning for it. Of course, the ultimate missing station is a proper front Spadina, and when I say proper, I mean a station that actually serves all lines. You might have noticed that I mentioned before that there was the potential for a station east of Union Station that didn't serve all lines, and that's because East Harbour, the station even further to the east, does. But in the case of Spadina, some of the lines diverge a little bit to the west of it, and so it's a perfect location, spacing-wise, but also because it covers all Western GO lines, to put a shoulder and junction station. Now, the lack of a station here isn't just a problem in itself, but it makes the lack of connections at King Liberty even more glaring, since 3 of the routes that pass through Spadina also pass through King Liberty. So at least if you're not going to build Spadina, you should build King Liberty as a junction and transfer station so that some of those trips and transfers can still happen. But that's not the plan. Perhaps more importantly though, at Spadina you could take the Lakeshore West line, historically Toronto's most used mainline rail line, and do a lot of transfers to those other western lines, which are a lot more different in direction. For example, the Barrie line travels basically dead north, and hence there would be a lot of potential trips which we're just totally going to miss out on. Now, the lack of reasonable connections and the like matters less with GO's current service model, which might be part of why we're not seeing them planned. When your whole network is focused around long-distance commuters and low frequencies, the idea that people might want to take different trips using multiple lines and transferring probably just doesn't really occur. Even if the fundamental idea behind regional express rail and GO expansion is to enable this exact type of thing. Someone who's living at the southern end of Liberty Village should be able to get on the Lakeshore line, travel over to Spadina, and then travel up on the Barrie line, traveling the 3 kilometers north to Bloor Lansdowne quite quickly. But with the current plans, not only is that trip going to be 30% longer, which is really bad for a fairly short trip, but worse still, it will eat up capacity from Exhibition straight into the most important station in all of Canada. At the same time, someone at Kennedy, a stated mobility hub, and one of the most important interchange stations in the entire country, who wants to travel to Rouge Hill, a very popular urban national park just a few kilometers to the east, well, they won't be able to simply travel south and then transfer at Scarborough Junction. Instead, they'll have to travel south, quite a bit west, and then all the way back east, because there won't be transfers available at Scarborough Junction. This will lengthen their trip by 70%. Some people will just take a bus on this journey directly parallel to rail lines which we spent tons of money enhancing, and a lot of people will just get in their car because it's more convenient, and that is so frustrating. Now, I think there's a central problem in all of this, and I think there's a reason why we aren't seeing a lot of these stations. And that's because it's easy to not think about trips that people just aren't making today and focus a ton on the trips that people are. Long-distance commuter trips which might be hurt a little by a shoulder station, even though they won't because electric trains and the like. Most people are not transit experts, and they shouldn't have to be, but they're not going to be advocating for trips that they don't even know they could be making more conveniently. Fundamentally, the model we have in North America almost universally is centered on single downtown stations. So even with electric service, we aren't reinventing anything or getting a fraction of the potential out of our networks that we could be. We're just cleaning the networks up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.